T.S. Eliot, a very short name. Tradition and Individual Talent, a long title. But the essay is very short. But the critical pronouncements contained in this essay have far-reaching consequences for the 20th century critics. First, he denounces the Romantic criticism. Second, he puts emphasis on tradition and individual talent. And third, he declares the death of author. So, sir, I request you to summarize this essay, throwing light on these main aspects of the essay.
Yeah, very rightly. You have very rightly pointed out that the essay is seminal. Seminal in the sense that it marks a very, very significant shift in the emphasis that was previously given. So very, very important essay, because it marks the beginning of what we later on came to be known as new criticism, and then later developments that were offshoots of this new criticism. Okay. So very important essay.
Right.
Yeah, it's a very brief essay. The essay is divided into three parts. In the first section of the essay, Eliot talks about tradition. He defines traditions and he examines the relationship of any particular poem or poet to the poetic tradition in which that poet works or in which that poem is written. In the second part, Eliot talks about relationship between the poem and the poet. And in the third part, as you said, it talks about the shift in the emphasis from the author to the text. As you said, the death of the author.
But not the physical one.
No, not the physical one, but the biographical element in a work. And he shifts the emphasis and he puts the text in the center.
Okay,
so that
close
was
study of the text.
Close study of the text. Instead of poet or instead of the author, now the center of interest is the text. So these three aspects of Eliot's essays are very significant. First is his idea of tradition. Usually, when we associate the term tradition with a poet, we use it rather derogatively. We use it to criticize a poet, that he is too traditional.
We mean to say he imitates his predecessors.
He imitates, and we consider it to be a negative point, a negative quality, a negative trait of the poet or the writer. But Eliot says that is not true. Tradition, he has an idea of tradition that is very wide. Tradition is not just following or imitating the dogmas or the customs of a given tradition or of a given culture. It is much more than that. So he says tradition is a larger term for T.S. Eliot. And he says that it is much like the ethos of this age. Right from the sacred, rituals of religion to how a person greets a stranger in a given culture. So that is tradition, the completeness of the life of a given culture. That is his idea of tradition, and he does not believe in slavish imitation of this tradition.
Okay.
Rather, he says that this tradition is not inherited. That just because you are born in a given culture, you will inherit the tradition of that culture, or you will inherit the tradition of that literature. It is not like that.
It has to be grasped.
It has to be grasped. It has to be acquired, and acquired with labor. That is to say, he says that the poet or the writer must have a knowledge of all the great writers of that tradition. So for in the context of England, he says, or America, he says that it is not just limited to the national border. He says the writer writing, he talks about Western tradition. So he says right from Homer and classical Greek writers to the present day, the whole European tradition is one, and the poet must acquire the knowledge of this tradition and must immerse himself in that tradition. That was his idea of tradition.
So is it right to say that according to Eliot, tradition is not something that is dead, but something that is already living.
Yes, that's why he says that the historical sense, that is what he emphasizes. And he says that it is not the pastness of the past that is important, but the present of the past. That is very important. So he says that the history or historical sense or tradition lives in the present, and it's present that is what is more important. So in our Indian context, when we talk about Ram or Krishna, it is not the pastness of Ram or Krishna, but how Ram and Krishna are alive, are still living in us, in our perception of life, in our attitude to life. That is what makes tradition. So pastness of past, that is what he says. And he says it is timeless and yet temporal. Timeless and temporal. It is timeless in the sense that it does not have any past or present, and it is temporal in the sense that it exists even today. So that was what was more important for Eliot.
And so at the second stage, in the second section, he disapproves the romantic criticism. Why? Why is it so?
Yes, the gist of the matter is his idea of tradition. And he says a sense of a tradition implies certain things. One is recognition of the continuity of literature. That, right, for instance, if we take our example, a poet or a writer writing in Gujarati or Bengali has his roots way back in the classical Sanskrit literature.
Certainly.
Yeah, and Nissim Ezekiel, I am reminded of that at present. He said that my poetic ancestors are Sanskrit poets. So that is tradition. So that recognition of the continuity of literature. A work of art, maybe a poem or a novel, does not exist in isolation. It exists in a continuity. It is a part of a chain. It is a continuity. And the second thing he says is that the poet has to develop a critical judgment of the great authors of the past. And he has to sift the good one from the bad. Because a tradition has produced so many works, so many authors. So the poet has to sift the great from the ordinary. That is more important. Form a critical judgment of the greatness in literature. That is the second part of it. And the third part of it is that this tradition, or the knowledge of tradition, or the idea of tradition is to be obtained with an effort. That's what he says. That it is not something that you passively inherit. It is not something that is bestowed upon you. It is something that you have to strive to get it. So, in this sense, Eliot's idea of tradition is dynamic, and every poet adds to the tradition, he says. That is what was more important. And in this tradition, in this essay, he talks about impersonality of the author. That impersonality is something that marks the breach from the romantic criticism. That marks a shift from the romantic criticism. That is how he rejects romantic criticism. In romantic criticism, personality of the author was important. He was considered to be a genius, a gifted person, and the poetry is an expression of his gift, his genius, etc. So author's personality was important. Here he says the author has to achieve impersonality, and he takes the analogy of a scientific experiment in which two chemicals, oxygen and sulfur dioxide, when they are mixed in the presence of platinum, it converts into sulfuric acid. But sulfuric acid does not have any trace of platinum. So platinum is the catalyst. Similarly, a poet's mind is the catalyst, and he has to achieve that impersonality. He has to keep himself aloof. So it is not an expression of personality, it is an extinction of personality. That is how he understands his idea of impersonality. So poetry is not a letting loose of emotions, he says, it is an escape from emotion. That is how he values the impersonality of the poet. This is how the whole poet, and then in the last part he stresses the need for concentrating on the close reading of the text. And that began the new criticism as we know it today.
Thanks. Thank you, sir. Thanks for your lecture.